So, the book of Daniel. Daniel is one of those great books in the Old Testament that brings you all over the place on all sorts of weird, fun, unique adventures, and ultimately teaches us a very important lesson about God, that God is in control. So, as we're looking in the book of Daniel, and we turn there in just a moment, we're going to see that the Israelites, God's chosen people, are wondering, where is God? Because you see, they had been put into exile, they had been cast out of their homeland because of their sin, because they wouldn't listen to God. And so God said, if you're not going to listen to me, you're not going to live in the land that I've blessed you with. And so they're sent out into exile, and they're wondering, does God still care about us? Where is he when we're captured by these wicked people? And the faithful Israelites who knew, well, we're here because of our sin, they're wondering, how do we live since we are in exile? And as we go along, we're going to see these major characters. We're going to learn this application, see these big words, these major events. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves and just go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 1, where I'll start reading. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. So we'll stop right here. So Judah is the southern kingdom of Israel. God's people were so messed up with their sin that they couldn't even stay together. The country had divided apart. And Judah was the southern kingdom and had Jerusalem, the center of Israel's religious life. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes and sieges. That means he surrounds and starves out this city until he gets to capture it. And look in verse 2, the Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility. So here's a big phrase in Daniel, especially in these early chapters. The Lord handed. What this means is that nothing that happens in Daniel is outside of God's control. The Israelites had trusted in their kings, had trusted in their religious systems, had trusted in the noble class, and their family and their lineage, all these things instead of God. And so God's allows Nebuchadnezzar to take these things over, because if they're not going to trust God, they're not going to get any of it. And so we see that Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and not only does he take things from the temple, but he puts them in his own temple. You see, the Babylonians and all other pagans, people who worship multiple gods without a set system, and certainly without the true God, they collect gods like Pokemon cards. They only get all of them. And so Nebuchadnezzar takes these relics from the temple thinking, I've conquered this people, and now their God can sit until I need him to do me a favor. And so this is what happens, but this is not outside of God's control. The Israelites trusted so much in the temple, in the things in the temple, and their king, that they thought, surely if these things are gone, then so is God. But we know that's not the case. So verse 4, now remember, the king ordered his chief eunuch, his chief servant, to bring in some of the young Israelite men from the noble family. And here's what kind of men he's dragging in. Young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction and all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean, that means Babylonian, language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to attend the king. Among them, from the Judahites, the people from Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave the name Belshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. So here's what we have going on here. The king drags in the very best and brightest of Israel's young men. I like to say he gave them a full ride scholarship to Babylonian University. He wanted to bring them in, give them the best of food, the best of wisdom, the best of education, indoctrinate them so they could serve on his royal court. Another thing ancient kings collected like Pokemon cards were advisors, particularly of the religious or the magical kind. And so he wants to bring in Israel's young men because Babylon was the world empire. They captured everything else. They wanted to get as much as they could from Israel too. And so they bring in these guys, and among them were our main characters, particularly one main character, and that's Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now the king gives them new names, and the ancient world names were very important, even more important than they are today. Now, of course, your name is important because people call you by your name. But in the ancient world, when you called somebody by a name, it wasn't just saying what they were called or how to identify them. It was kind of about who they were. And so they have these names like Daniel. His name means God is my judge. And so all of these young guys from Israel, their names were about God, were about a particular thing about God. The Babylonians couldn't have that. They couldn't have them remembering that they belong to God. They are supposed to belong to Babylon. That's why they get the very best of food, the best of education, to indoctrinate them into the system and serving a wicked empire that doesn't know or revere God at all. And so they come in, and each of these guys take out the name of the true God and put in the names of their own gods. So we'll put here, if you can see it, false God is my judge. Now these all had names, but here's the point. They wanted to erase their identities in God. The Babylonians couldn't afford to have these people thinking they belonged to anybody else but them. And this is the way that sin works. Because we, in our natural state, are separated from God because we choose to do things that God doesn't want us to do. And so we also, even though we were made by God in His image to serve Him, we scratch out God and we put in whatever we want. Or maybe we're not putting in that. Maybe the world's putting that in. Maybe there's other influences that say, sex is my judge. Parties is my judge. Video games is my judge. Popularity is my judge. It's so easy for us to focus on anything other than God because the world tries to drag us away from God. But here's the good news. Even in exile, even in this bad spot that Israel's in, God still loves His people. God still wants to save them, and God's still working. And so these young guys, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are going to turn to God, and God's going to bless them greatly because He loves them. So we see in verse 8, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. Now let's stop here. Why would the food from the king's table defile Daniel? That means to make unclean or to make wrong. Well, speaking of unclean, the Israelites had a term called unclean. You see, God called apart Israel to be His own people. He said, you're not going to be stuck in sin like these other guys. You're not going to worship false gods like these other guys. You're going to be mine and mine alone. And because I'm calling you out of this sin to love me, to serve me, to know me, and because I'm going to bless you, you can't look like everybody else. You have to be different. And so God instituted a system of clean and unclean foods. It was a way for even when the Israelites were eating to know we belong to God and He loves us and He treasures us and He wants us to be set apart from sinful people. And so there were some foods that the king would have had that were unclean, that weren't supposed to be eaten by God's people. And so Daniel determined he would not defile himself. He resolved. He got to the moment of trial and he said, there's no way I'm compromising who I am in God. And here's the problem. Ancient kings, they like to collect gods and religious treasures and advisors like Pokemon cards. They also like to kill people. Now later, King Nebuchadnezzar is going to use his favorite line, I'm going to tear you limb from limb and make your house a garbage dump. This is not a guy you want to make angry. And so how is Daniel going to tell this king, who specifically brought in Daniel to indoctrinate him into his royal advisory board and tell this king, I don't want the food that you're giving me? Well, we'll see. In verse 9, God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Once again, the Lord handed, God granted, God gave. God is working. And so Daniel's decided, I'm going to be faithful no matter what. And God's given him a way to do that. He's helped the servant think favorably of Daniel. Yet the servant said to Daniel, I fear the Lord my king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. So Daniel's determined he's going to be faithful no matter what. And he trusts that if God wants him to do something, and it's the right thing to do, that no matter what, it's going to turn out okay. And so Daniel says, well, look, I know you're feeding your guys the catfish, the nice bread, the wine, all these things, nutritious, rich, full of calories, full of protein. Now, we don't know for sure that the young Babylonian men were on any sort of exercise regimen, but certainly they would have needed to be strong and look strong. And eating vegetables and water is not the way to do that. That's why when people work out, they try to eat protein, they eat chicken, they get protein powder, whatever it is. Because eating vegetables and water while other guys are chowing down on catfish is just not a way to get shredded. But here's what happens. Daniel says, we'll eat the vegetables, just the vegetables for 10 days. Then look at the other guys, look at us, see who looks better. If we look worse, the implication is, then we'll go back to eating the king's food. But Daniel doesn't believe he's going to have to. He knows that eating the king's food is sinful, and so he trusts that somehow God's going to get him a way out of it. So verse 15, here's what happens. At the end of the 10 days, they, meaning Daniel and his friends, looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and wine and gave them vegetables. So the test has come. Daniel says, I'm going to be faithful no matter what. That's a big thing we learn. And Daniel, trust God no matter what, because he's got you. If you are following him, if you love him, if you're sold out to him, no matter what happens, God's going to get you protected somehow. But more than that, in verse 17, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. So not only does he keep these guys healthy and keep them from having to give into sin, he gives them more wisdom and intelligence than anybody else. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time, the king had said to present them. So in other words, after they had been trained for so long, and were supposed to be brought before the king, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So here's what's going on. Not only does God protect them from sinning, but because they're faithful and they're in this position, yes, away from their homeland, yes, in the midst of wicked, evil people who don't love God, but God blesses them not only with wisdom, but a position to use it. You see, sometimes we're put in bad spots, not for our sake, but for others' sakes. And as we're going to see in the rest of Daniel, Daniel being there and being so godly has a big difference on this whole kingdom. And so God blesses them, and Daniel stays there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's decades later. In fact, we're going to see at the end of the book, Daniel gets dragged out of retirement because it's very small, a very smart old fart. Because he trusted God and God blessed him. So to go back over Daniel 1, Israel's taken into exile because of their sin, and they wonder, where is God? How do we live in exile? The answer is God's right here with you. If you turn to him He's going to love you. He's going to protect you. He's going to keep you in his hands oh so tightly. And if you simply live faithful to him, turning away from your sins and following him, trusting that he's going to be with you no matter what, things are going to turn out well. The next time we're going to see in chapter 2 that not only in the moment when you follow God, things will turn out well. In the grand scheme of world history, God's got his hand over it. God is in control. And so as we look to chapter 2 next week, I hope you'll join us and watch it then, and we should be having a great time.